its story, as told by the people that lived it. We'll walk the streets of yesteryear and relive the days of the horse and buggy, when times were much simpler and things moved slower. We'll visit historical buildings and look at age-old artifacts, which will always be a part of Royal Oak after the people move on. We'll observe the city as it has grown and prospered, and then wonder, what will tomorrow bring? To the people, to the places, to the things of Royal Oak.
Hi, I'm Mike Kondak. Welcome again to the studios of Municipal Access Channel 34 here in the Royal Oak Library. With me today is a real special guest. It's Bob Dondero. He's the son of George Dondero, longtime congressman from Royal Oak, the city's first mayor, and various and sundry other things that we'll find out about as we talked about today. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's start with say your dad's early life. We know, for example, that he's born in the 1883 in Detroit. He moves at a very early age to a farm in what is now Oak Park, right?
Right.
Where he lives with his brother.
At that time. He was 2 years old when he moved there. And he told me that it was some of the worst farmland in Oakland County for his folks to raise anything on. It's on the 9 mile near Scotia. And he went to the Clinton School, one-room schoolhouse from there.
After he graduates, he then does what? Let's take it from about the early years of the century on. Say 1903. He becomes the first village clerk of Royal Oak in 1905.
All right. He came to Royal Oak in 1899 to go to high school. Mm-hmm. His older brother, Gus, was in Royal Oak at the time running a tavern, the Royal Oak Tavern, which constituted rooms and they had a restaurant and a bar. And Dad worked for him for his room and board, tending bar and cleaning the spittoons and things of that nature, sweeping up the floor.
I read where your father was also a teetotaler. Is that true?
Yes.
All his life?
Yes, he was.
Okay.
Yes, because he saw so many townsmen come in and spend their week's earnings on liquor while their families suffered. Yeah. And went without.
Okay.
And that's why he never drank.
So how did he get involved in, I guess it wasn't a political job per se, but how did he get involved in the government around that time? As I say, he becomes the village clerk, and he becomes treasurer in 1907, he becomes the assessor in 1909, getting involved in
Well, he just became interested in those things, and showing the interest, why they hired him to do these things. So, and one thing led to another, and then he was interested in schools, and so he was able to get elected to the school board.
Okay, that's 1910. He also, in the interim, is attending night classes at the Detroit College of Law.
That is right.
Okay.
That is correct. And so he graduated from law school in 1910. Detroit.
Where was he working at that time in the interim while he was going to law school, do you recall? Was it still the saloon or various and sundry other jobs?
I presume he was doing different things. He did work for a Mr. Ford, a butcher, and he learned how to cut meat and he would deliver the meat to the outskirts and the farm areas, and then take their orders for the next week. So he'd go out there once a week and make his rounds, and then come back and cut meat for the townspeople and so on, working for this Mr. Ford for a while. I can't tell you exactly what years those were.
Okay.
He also went into business for himself with insurance and real estate and hay and feed. And there's a picture of that same building.
All in the same story, selling hay and feed and insurance?
Yes.
That's
pretty interesting. In 1905. And I think you will find one of the historical pictures showing that in there. And it shows a horse and dray out in front. This was on Main Street, just a couple of doors north of 4th on the east side, near what is now the Herman's Bakery. which before then was a Dondero bakery.
Right.
That was owned by Gus Dondero.
Which is your father's older brother.
That is correct.
Okay. So your father's graduated from law school. He becomes a member of the Royal Oak School Board. He's doing all these things at the same time. He's village clerk, he's treasurer, he's assessor. He's also on the school board during all these years, doing it obviously not for the income. He's got a full-time job to support him, and he marries around that time as well, right?
1913.
Okay. And so he goes on. Now, Royal Oak becomes a city in 1921, and George Dondero becomes the city's first mayor. He was elected to that position. Do you know how many terms, or do you know how long he served in that capacity?
I think he served only 1 or 2 terms at the most. Gus Dondero was on that commission.
The first city commission?
The first city commission, that's right. Among some other notable people in town, Codling was one I remember. And if I had their pictures in front of me, I could remember. Your
father's interests seem to go off in the direction of more the school board. It is during the first of all, during the time, during his tenure as president of the school board, he builds the first high school, Royal Oak High School. I believe it's constructed at that time.
Yes, he was president of it at the time that first high school was built.
And in fact, they built a number of school buildings during those years.
Yes.
To support Royal Oak's burgeoning population. I mean, he gets there. When we're first looking at the career of George Dondero, we see South Oakland County being nothing but farmland. Slowly but surely, it's becoming this bedroom suburb of Detroit with rather large-scale development. So he's there sort of at the birth of all of this.
That's right.
And in large part is I suppose responsible for the construction of the public school system.
Well, he had a lot to do with it, but there were many other people, of course, that worked with him too. I wouldn't say he was the spearheader, but he might have been that too. The high school was built in 1927. When he was president of the school board at that time.
This, of course, is the high school that later bears his name, right?
That is right. It was renamed after him in 1955. But it was just the Royal Oak High School at that time.
Yeah. Okay, take us between, let's say, the years 28 to 32. In 1932, he's going to be elected to Congress on the Republican ticket. But what is George doing in those 4 years, let's say about the time the stock market crashed, that era?
I don't remember too much, but I know he was practicing law. And I know he helped a lot of people in town. In other words, he bought a number of land contracts so as to help a person buy a house or loan them money to go to college. Mr. Owen Perkins, Sr., told me that my father loaned him the money to go to college when he first came to Royal Oak.
Not as a banker, but
just as personal.
I see.
Just a personal loan, and he paid him back later on, of course. But
describe your father in general. What sort of traits, what strikes you about him?
Well, he was a very kind man, and charming with the ladies and everybody, naturally. He was a very, very good person and very fair that I can remember as a child.
He sounds like a workaholic just from what you've been describing to us, or is that sort of common in those days to have an individual work, say in a business insurance?
No, he was a hard worker. He got up early in the morning, and he was a very scheduled person. He scheduled his time.
I understand he was quite a bug for punctuality. If you were late for an appointment with him, look out, right?
That is right. Very much so. Punctuality was one of his favorite things to have. He was very good to the family and to my mother. He was Dad wasn't a liberal type of person, very conservative.
Sure.
And he studied Lincoln all his life, and so by doing that, he gradually took on Lincoln's ways, not living like Lincoln, but living by his principles.
Yeah.
And this is what I remember about Dad a lot.
I'm sorry, Bob, go ahead.
At the dinner table, for instance, he would say, "What date is this? This is such and such a date. Well, on this date, such and such happened about the Civil War or some particular individual," and he would get to the human interest points of talking about the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. And it didn't mean a great deal to me then, but it does to me now. Those little different things that he would tell us.
It has been said, at least in some of the things that I've read, that perhaps your father may be on a par with Carl Sandburg in terms of being a Lincoln scholar, in terms of the things he knew about him and the studies that he did.
He could have been. He didn't write books like Sandburg, or who was the other man from Beulah, Michigan?
Bruce Catton.
Bruce Catton.
Yeah.
You know, but he knew them, of course. And but Dad was, to my way of thinking, a great man, a great statesman type of person.
Let's get back into the congressional campaign of, say, 1932. You're a young boy. Maybe you can't remember that. You're probably 8 or 9 years old. Was it exciting? Do you remember what was going on at that time?
Oh yes, it was exciting. And when he was running for election,
which, by the way, is as a Republican in a Democratic sweep year, right? This is 1932, the year that Roosevelt has swept into office along with the New Deal and the Democrats and etc. And he's elected to office as a Republican, sort of against the tide, I guess.
Yeah, we used to kid him and say he sort of rode in on the coattails of Roosevelt, but he didn't like that too well. I remember working as a for him, you might say, passing out literature. They'd have cavalcades.
What was that, Bob?
Where a group of cars and notables and people would go from town to town, where they'd have fairs and things, and Dad would speak, just like the old Chautauqua days that you might have heard about, where men and women would go and give talks of the day, and he would give us campaign speeches at that time, and then I'd be out in the group passing out literature to the various people. It was fun for me. And then at home, I'd go down the street with some neighbor boys or something and putting literature in the doorstep and mailboxes and so on, or handing them out to whoever would take them. They do the same thing today, of course.
Now, how did it work growing up? Dad moves to Washington, probably around the time the new Congress is seated. I suppose that's well, I don't know if it was March in those days or January, but anyway, he moves to Washington, gets an apartment, I think, in one of the hotels there.
Yes, the Continental Hotel.
Okay, where I think he stayed all of his congressional career.
All
is that
of
right?
his congressional life, he stayed in the Continental Hotel.
Now, what was it like, you know, to be the son of a congressman, say, in the early 30s or the mid 30s? Did you see him much?
No, I didn't. He wasn't home a great deal. The first year that both he and Mother went to Washington, he hired a couple to come in and stay with us. And their name is the Kinners, Ann and Lee Kinner, and they're still living today.
They are?
Yes. She will be 90 and he'll be 88, 29th of this month. And I kind of call them my foster parents because they didn't have any children, and I've known them all my life, so I kind of take.
So they actually moved in with you on the house on 7th Street, or?
Yes, they stayed there a whole year with us, and of course I was a boy of about 10 at that time.
Yeah.
So, but let's see, I was born 23, 1933. Excuse me. Well,
go ahead. Well, what do you? You were telling me you spent a little bit of time in Washington when you were a little bit older?
Yes. When I was in the 6th grade, my dad asked me if I wanted to stay home or go to Washington and go to school there for the term. And I said I wanted to go to Washington, actually. Well, school had already started here, and school had started there too, sooner than it started here. So it was, they didn't want me to start in because I would be too late in getting going.
Yeah.
So I just took the whole semester off and did what I could to help Dad and the secretaries in the office, and I helped address envelopes, and I did some page work for Dad, taking things to other congressmen in the building. I went on the floor of the House and I met all the pages there. They were very helpful, and they showed me around and showed me where they went to school. I could go on the floor of the House up until I was at the age of 16, being a congressman's son. So that was kind of a thrill, you know, to sit down there and be able to see all the congressmen. And I met a few of them. Oh, there was one fiery character from Allegan County here, Claire Hoffman was his name. And he was a real fighter in the House, and he was interesting to watch. Really.
Was he Democrat, Republican?
No, he was Republican also, yeah.
So he was a sort of anti-Roosevelt type Republican at that time?
I believe so.
Yeah. Now, when you say he was a fighter or whatever, just flamboyant character, a la
very much so.
Huey Long,
like Huey Long type of thing.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
And you met him?
I met him, yes. And he, they lived at the Hotel Continental too. So I got to know he and his wife.
Now, how often would your dad come back, say, to the home district there? Let's back up a second. This district comprised what? It was a fairly good chunk of land. I mean, we're talking about a good portion of Oakland County, but Wayne County as well, right?
It was all of Oakland County.
Oh, okay.
It was all of Oakland County in the 22nd Ward of Detroit, which would be
West Side-ish, sort of.
Yes. Roseville Park, is that correct? Rosedale Park.
Rosedale Park, okay.
Yeah, that area.
Yeah.
Down there. That's right.
All right. So how often, let's say, would he come back for a visit with the home folks or whatever?
Well, it depended upon the year and the things, but I would say maybe not more than 2 or 3 times a year. I'm guessing now. I really don't know.
But Congress was in session from the fall until the summer. Would he spend his summers back here in Michigan, or was he still pretty involved?
Oh yes, the summers, when Congress would adjourn, then he would, we'd go up to Mackinac.
You spent your summers on Mackinac Island?
No, Mackinac City.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we couldn't afford the island. That was pretty expensive. No, Mackinac City on what is now Wawatam Beach, and it was at that time too. And that's where I kind of grew up. Well, I should say we spent the first 2 years going up to Mullet Lake, north of Toppanaby, at Royal Oak Beach.
Oh, yeah?
Yes. And we rented, the first cottage we rented was a Mr. Wilson's cottage on Royal Oak Beach. Somebody he met through the church, I presume, from Methodist Church. So that was an interesting first 2 summers.
Yeah. Tell us about your dad politically. We understand he was a sort of conservative Republican. He was kind of an isolationist, if I read it correctly. He was a little bit opposed to America getting entrenched with Great Britain and as World War II began to approach, or?
Well, I believe so. I really don't remember too much about his politics, and I didn't read much about his politics in those days. But
you never got any flack as a high school student or anything like, your old man's full of beans or something like that, or did that happen once or twice?
No, we never got into that, but I do remember getting into some arguments in high school with another fellow who was on the opposite side of the fence. He
more of a Democrat.
He was a Democrat, and I was a Republican, and we used to get into some real hot arguments at lunchtime or something like that.
What was your dad's biggest accomplishment? What was the thing he was most proud of as he served in Congress?
Well, his crowning glory in Congress, of course, was the passage of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1954.
Now, this is something he worked for a long time.
About 20 years.
Yeah.
He first went on what was called the Rivers and Harbors Committee. And then that was later consolidated with the Road Committee, and so they call it the Public Works. So roads and sea and waterways were kind of combined together.
All right, for the benefit of our viewers, maybe they don't realize what the St. Lawrence was and what it is now. You could not, as I recall, there was no way of shipping anything directly from, say, ports like Detroit or Chicago out to the Atlantic.
Or vice versa.
Right.
It was limited to the size of the vessels at that time. They were smaller when they first, before they started to increase the size and build the St. Lawrence Seaway. I understand now they could have built it even larger. But it will take good-sized ocean-going ships so that they can come directly in to the Great Lakes without having to unload and have them transported by train. Of course, the railroads were very much against this at the time, so they were fighting it. Naturally, there's always people for and against anything on any program of this nature. But this allowed, and I have a film too, which shows the construction of it, narrated by Walter Cronkite, that will I'd be glad to show anybody anytime.
In fact, when you mentioned his crowning achievement, one of the big canals there in New York State is actually named the Wiley-Dondero Canal.
Yes, that is between the Eisenhower Lock and the Bertrand Snell Lock. It's about 10 miles long. A ship channel is called the Wiley-Dondero Ship.
Wiley being another congressman that
No, Wiley was the senator. Senator Wiley from Wisconsin would be like the spearheader in the Senate, and as Dad was in the House of Representatives. At that time, my father was chairman of the Public Works Committee, became chairman of the Public Works Committee. And so that's how the two got together in pushing this thing through and pulling the ship out of the bottle, so to speak, as the cartoon you might be seeing.
Yeah. Bob is okay. We'll think then about your father retires from Congress after being elected 12 times, 12 consecutive terms. He finally retires in 1957. Describe his remaining 10 or 11 years. He returned, I think, to practice law, and in fact had an office, in the Washington Square building?
Yes, he did. And he also had a number of land contracts where people would come up to pay him. And he enjoyed that very much, just talking to people. This was one of his main things. He enjoyed talking to people. A woman came up to me not too long ago and told me how Dad used to come by their house on Lafayette when he was living on Lafayette and just stop and talk. And they'd be out on the porch, and he'd come up on the porch and talk to them. He was very friendly with people.
Returning to that, to our little discussion about him being a Lincoln scholar and in fact sort of molding himself after Lincoln's character or persona, I wonder if you can tell us the story. It's a very interesting one about the letter that he had from Grace Bedell, the letter written to Mr. Lincoln during the campaign of 1860 and how he came to acquire it, and just the whole story behind that.
Yes, I'll be glad to. It's not too short. My father knew Robert Todd Lincoln, became acquainted with him in 1923.
That is Abraham
Lincoln's oldest son.
Yes.
The only one who survived and lived and died of old age.
Right.
He lived to about 83 years of age. Anyway, in 1923, he and several other gentlemen went to visit Robert Todd Lincoln in Washington, at his office in Washington. And during that interview, this was in March 5th, 1923. And he wrote down his remarks of this interview and then had his secretary type them later, and I have them today, which is quite an interesting interview. And I'll be glad to give anybody a copy that might like one.
What did they talk about? Lincoln, the personality?
Yes, he asked him, well,
just like you and I are reminiscing about your father, they were reminiscing about, Robert Todd was reminiscing about him.
And he wanted to know, he asked Robert Todd Lincoln, he said, where were you when your father was shot? And he said, the story was that he was in the theater at the time, but he wasn't. He said, no, he said, I had just come home from Appomattox. See, Robert Todd was a captain in the Army at that time, attached to the staff of General Grant. And he had spent 2 weeks on the road coming home, horseback, boat, and so on. And he was awfully tired and dirty and slept in his uniform for a week or so. And he said, so I begged off going to the theater with my father and mother. And he said, later on, I was awakened by Lincoln's secretary, John Hay, who came in and said, your father's been shot. And I asked him where, and he said, in the arm. And so he said, I got dressed and I went over to the theater, and of course, taking one look at my father, I knew that he wasn't going to live because his face was as black as your coat, pointing to my father's coat. This was one incident that is written down that I remember reading about. And incidentally, my father named me after Robert.
Your middle name is Lincoln.
My middle name is Lincoln, without the Todd, because I was born 5 days later after that interview on March 10th. Well, let's get back to the Grace Bedell letter now.
Okay.
This is how my father first met Robert Todd Lincoln, and then of course his family, Mrs. Mary Lincoln, and the children of the family. Robert Todd died in 1926. In 1929, my father was again visited the Lincoln family in Vermont, Manchester, Vermont. And he asked Mrs. Lincoln at that time, he said, I heard about a letter that a little girl of 11 years old had written to Lincoln about growing a beard. And she said, oh yes, would you like to see it? And so she went and got it out of the trunks that was handed down through Robert and showed it to Dad. And this was the first time that it had been shown to anybody else, you might say. And Dad took such a great interest in it, of course. And she said, would you be the courier and take this letter and give it to the original writer, Grace Bedell Billings was her married name. She'd married a banker living in Delphos, Kansas. So Dad agreed that he would, and he took it home with him. He wrote a letter to Grace Bedell, and of course she was a lady in her 80s at that time. And she was so surprised, of course, that the letter was still in existence. But he took it down to her and showed it to her. And
we have a copy of that letter we're gonna run, and why don't you just read the text of that, Bob, if you could, just so the people at home can...
I just want to finish one thing on it. The copy, the answer to her letter from Abraham Lincoln was hanging on her wall in her living room. And how Dad happened to come by this letter was, she more or less said, well, I'm an aged woman, and you have such a great interest in Lincoln and these things. Why don't you keep the letter and use it as you see fit for posterity? And so this is how my father came by this letter, first from Mrs. Robert Todd Lincoln, and then the original writer. And of course, he wouldn't part with it. Then it became a very treasured item to him.
I can imagine.
And he spoke about it very frequently.
Yeah.
All right, you'd like to...
read the text of it, just so...
Okay. This letter is from Westfield, Chautauqua County, New York, October 15th, 1860. To Honorable A.B. Lincoln. I don't know why she called him A.B., but maybe she just heard people call him Abe, and this is what her interpretation of it was. Dear Sir, my father has just home from the fair and brought home your picture and Mr. Hamlin's. He was the running mate of Mr. Lincoln.
Hannibal Hamlin, right. Go ahead.
Very good. I am a little girl, only 11 years old, but want you should be President of the United States very much. So I hope you won't think me very bold to write to such a great man as you are. Have you any little girls about as large as I am? If so, give them my love and tell her to write me, if you cannot answer this letter. I have got 4 brothers, and part of them will vote for you anyway, and if you will let your whiskers grow, I will try and get the rest of them to vote for you. You would look a great deal better, for your face is so thin. All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. My father is going to vote for you, and if I was a man, I would vote for you too. But I will try and get everyone to vote for you that I can. I think that rail fence around your picture makes it look very pretty. I have got a little baby sister. She is 9 weeks old and is just as cunning as can be. When you direct your letter, direct to Grace Bedell, Westfield, Chautauqua County, New York. I must not write any more. Answer this letter right off. Goodbye, Grace Bedell.
Okay.
Well, to write to a president and ask him to answer it right off is something else there.
A little moxie there on Grace's part.
Well, this is one letter that Abraham did answer right off, and I think this is one letter he was so pleased with that that's why he kept it, because he was getting so much criticism in those days.
His reply, I think, is dated October the 19th, and if it's written to him, where, in Washington? Or in Springfield, Illinois?
Springfield, Illinois.
So it gets from New York to...
Springfield.
And he writes a reply in 4 days?
Within 4 days.
Wow, okay.
Isn't that terrific?
What's his reply?
Springfield, Illinois, October 19th, 1860. Miss Grace Bedell. My dear little miss, your very agreeable letter of the 15th is received. I regret the necessity of saying I have no daughter. I have 3 sons, one 17, one 9, and one 7 years of age. They, with their mother, constitute my whole family. As to the whiskers, having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affection if I were to begin it now? Your very sincere well-wisher, A. Lincoln. Now, the word affection, I think he meant affectation. That was just an error on his part. Error on his part there. But that's the way he answered it there. And let's see, where were we in the story now?
Well, your father's gotten the letter from Robert Todd's widow.
Yes.
And with the instructions to take it to the Grace Bedell herself in Kansas.
Yes.
Grace has graciously bequeathed it to him and said, "Here, you can have it." Where's Lincoln's reply? Is that still in the?
I'm not sure. Later on, before Dad passed away, David Walper of Walper Studios in California wrote to my father asking if he would sell his letter because he had bought Lincoln's answer at auction in New York. Evidently, the heirs of Grace Bedell had acquired it and had turned it in for some money. They weren't selling it. And he'd paid $20,000 for Lincoln's answer. And he offered Dad the same amount of money for this letter. But Dad wouldn't sell it. In fact, he wouldn't even reply. So he got a telegram, a phone call, and...
Where did he keep it, by the way? At home, or was it
he kept it in a
safe
safe in his office. He had a safe in the office, so he kept it there. And he'd bring it out every once in a while and show it to people. And he'd also go to classrooms of children of that age, 3rd and 4th graders, and tell them the story and show them the actual letter. So this made quite an impression on the children of the day. And I do the same thing now, only I have copies of the letter. And I give a slide talk program to the Gwen Dondero, who's a teacher at Parker, for instance, in her 3rd grade class, and several other of the schools.
You were telling me that you visited the estate or Robert Todd Lincoln's house in home in Vermont. Tell us a little bit about that. Were you able to meet any of the family on your visits?
Oh, no. This was just a couple of years ago. The whole family is gone now. But when I was approaching the age of 16, one of the daughters of Robert Todd sent me a personal check written by Abraham Lincoln to his son Robert Todd Lincoln for $6. Canceled check, of course, and it was dated 1859. When Robert Todd became 16 years of age, and this, along with the letter sent to my father to be given to young Robert Lincoln at the age of 16, meaning me.
Yeah.
So I have that check and the letter, and my father's letter that tells about it, and her name was Mary Lincoln Isham. Her married name was Isham. And so I have that, and I talk about that check, and I take it along with me and show the school children. It's very impressive to them, of course, to see an actual signature of Abraham Lincoln on a check there.
Well, your father certainly lived to a hearty old age. He was 84 when he died.
Yes, that's right.
And quite an quite a career filled with accomplishments. If we, list them again: Royal Oak's first village clerk, first mayor, school board president later on, a congressman for 24 years, and the things that he was able to do in Washington. What do you think was the thing he was most proud of? What do you think that? What would he say to us all now? Say if he were around, or if he were on the Royal Oak scene.
Well, I haven't any idea what he would say now. Of course, I think with there's so much irresponsibility of Congress with the national debt and the deficit today. Why he would just shake his head in utter amazement at how poorly and how unstatesmanlike the congressmen are acting today.
In fact, he once made a speech deploring members of Congress for smoking behind the rail or something like that, correct?
Oh,
he was
yes.
quite a stickler for manners and
decorum,
promptness, etc.
That's right. And this was put into the record, congressional record. And every new year that of election year that men would come in, why he was asked by the Speaker of the House to give a talk to the House on decorum and order of the House. That's right. And it did make a difference, because they get pretty sloppy in their ways, putting their feet up on the chairs in front of them, and smoking cigars and reading newspapers on the floor of the House. And he'd say, well, how do you think your constituents think about you and the rest of the House when you're acting this way? They're sitting up in the galleries. What sort of impression are you giving them? So, and this did help an awful lot.
That's great. Well, Bob, thanks a lot for being with us. I just wanted to share one last thought. It was as I was reviewing some of the material in the historical collection here at the Royal Oak Library, one of the things said about him, I'm not sure who it was by, but he was eulogized at the time of his death in 1968. And it was said that he believed that in spite of shattered hopes and man's inhumanity to man, that there are bright goals ahead worth every ounce of energy one has to give them. And that struck me, that quote. That was the way he lived his life. That was what he really believed. And I think he was quite a guy, and I think it was very enjoyable to have you here and share some of your memories with us.
Well, thank you very much for asking me.
Okay, maybe we'll see you again too. Good. And thank you all for being with us.